Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Today we're going to talk about a pretty problematic weed, at least west of here, becoming more of an issue in Ohio, especially if you're on that border over there in the western part of the state. We've got a special guest all the way from Illinois. Aaron, go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Aaron Hager. I'm an associate professor of extension weed science in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois.
We are also joined by our resident weed specialist. Mark, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Mark Loux, Ohio State, resident weed specialist.
Great. Aaron, to kick us off, would you like to tell us how you got into this line of work?
I jokingly tell people I was never smart enough to be a farmer, so this was always my fallback routine. But in all truthfulness, I really had no idea what I wanted to do when I ended up going to my undergraduate career at SIU Carbondale. But I was always fascinated by seeing these large pieces of spray equipment pull into a field and unfold these massive booms, which at the time was probably no more than about 60 feet long. And you could actually spray something, and some plants died and other plants didn't die. And so that was always a curiosity to me. And it was further cultivated when I had interactions with Dr. George Kapusta at SIU, who actually was one who gave me good direction on pursuing a master's degree at Michigan State University with Dr. Karen Renner. And ultimately ended up back at the University of Illinois as an extension specialist in weed science, where I finished a PhD. And faculty position came open, one that was held for many, many years by Dr. Marshall Montgomery, and I've been there ever since. So that's how I ended up where I am.
So really, we know we're all dealing with resistant weeds at this point, and that's come into play, would you say, like the late 90s?
You know, it really depends a little bit regionally. I go back and look at our records, and we probably first documented resistance in Illinois maybe the early to mid 80s. With triazine-resistant common lamb's quarters. And kind of put things in perspective, when I got back to Illinois in 1993, I think we had about no more than 3 different species that we had documented resistance in the state. I think we're now up to 11 or 12. So in 27 years, I've either really done a good job of finding these things, or I've really screwed everything up, and I'm really not sure which. And I'm not sure I really know the answer to that either.
So your development, our development was ALS resistance probably first. I mean, if you look at Waterhemp specifically, which is, and you and Pat there at Pat Trano at Illinois probably have as much expertise in Waterhemp as anybody does in the country, I think, right?
Well, we've worked on, I think I did my first plot work with Waterhemp in 1996. So that was, 24 years ago.
Right. And that
put up my first plot work with that. So
that was when it was developing ALS resistance.
Correct.
So has it kind of cycled? Because I know some of our weeds like Marystil's kind of cycle depending on resistance and what herbicides we have available.
You know, it's been really interesting to watch, Mark, because, and I'll give you sort of a little snapshot of the history of this. Of course, Waterhemp's indigenous to Illinois. It's always been there. But until about 30 years ago, there were 2 people in Illinois who even recognized what it was. And one I just mentioned, Dr. Montgomery, and the other was my PhD advisor, Dr. Wax. But for some reason, and resistance played a large role in this, about the early part of the 1990s, late 80s, we started to see a lot of expansion of water hemp out of its historic area of distribution, which roughly, if you know Illinois, from Interstate 70, roughly Effingham over to St. Louis, if you would go south of Interstate 70, predominantly that's where water hemp originated from. But we began to see it moving more to the north and somewhat fairly rapidly. Now, we started our first plot work in 1996, and we actually had to travel about 2.5 hours to the southwest to do plot work. Now, the reason we did that, you do the math, that's 5 hours of windshield time. And that's, it's not really efficient use of time. And I get it, I'm a state employee, and we're not really that efficient. But the only reason that we really did it, that's where it was. We did not have a good water hemp population to work on in Champaign County, Illinois. Now you fast forward, 25 years, and we don't have that issue anymore. We can pretty much find water hemp distributed from the very northern part of the state, throughout the remainder of the southern, eastern, western, and central part of Illinois. And as we've tracked resistance over time, you're absolutely right. We were dominated by ALS chemistry. throughout a large part of the late 1980s into the 1990s, especially on the soybean side of things. And those products used to be very effective against water hemp. But as the populations evolved resistance to it, it became fairly obvious that that line of chemistry was going to, by itself, it was not going to be as effective anymore.
Right. And then,
Can I just, for people who might not be familiar with the terminology, can you give us a few products that would use ALS?
Sure. Some ALS products, I guess from yesteryears, one of the biggest ones that we had in soybean for many, many years was Pursuit. It came in on the coattails after we had some issues with scepter carryover back in 87, 88 during the drought year. Others would have been at the time Classic, for example. Pinnacle was another commonly used one in soybean. Accent and Beacon were two widely used ALS inhibitors for corn, principally for grass control.
so then Roundup Ready came along and you controlled it for a while and then kind of cycled back to glyphosate resistance, or did it never really get under control?
Yeah, we sort of tried to patch the ALS problem for a long time by throwing some PPO or diphenyl ethers in with some of the Pursuit containing products for a lot of years. And we sort of limped along, if you would, for a few years with that. But anybody who really understands water hemp knows that the efficacy of PPOs is very much size dependent. And once you get past roughly about a 4-inch tall plant, you got about as equal probability of missing it in the long run or having that treated plant recover as you do actually controlling it. So 1996 was the first year we had glyphosate resistant soybean. And it really didn't take long for a lot of people to say, boy, this works. And we really don't have to worry a whole lot about, what rate do we need? Because if we just add a little bit more and we can go after some bigger weeds, we don't really have to worry a lot about additives. AMS carries us the whole way. And why worry about tank mixes now? This seems to be the one product that's really going to carry us into the future. And I sort of lost track of the number of people that said, we don't need you weed science people anymore. I mean, we have glyphosate and it's never going to break down. It's never going to fail. But I can't find too many people now in Illinois who say that anymore.
I remember when I was working for crop consultant, and some of the comments from people were, well, you don't need to identify that weed. It's a Roundup Ready field. So, and that wasn't that long ago.
We first identified glyphosate resistance in water hemp. I believe it was 2006. I think it was after a year after Dr. Bradley identified it in Missouri. And we did a couple of years of field work on a population, and we felt reasonably confident to develop some recommendations, specifically for glyphosate-resistant water hemp, which, as far as I can find in our records, that was the first time that the weeds program at Illinois ever really came out with anything so specific in terms of recommendations. Generally, it's fairly broad. Here's your grass products, here's your broadleaf products. And I'll never forget, we used to have a program extension program that we would do called the Corn and Soybean Classic. And it was 5 or 6 different meetings around the state, and we'd bring 6 or 8 different university specialists to speak on that during the day. And in January of 2008, that was the year that we started launching this idea of these are the specific recommendations around glyphosate-resistant water hemp. And I'll never forget, because we actually had 5 specific recommendations. It was a 5-step approach. And we really cautioned people as, okay, there's 5 steps here. That doesn't mean that you take the one that you like the most and disregard the other 4. You start at the top and you work your way south. And it really took me all of about, I'm guessing maybe no longer than 2 minutes and 16 seconds in every presentation. And I had absolutely no credibility left with the audience. And the reason was that back in 2008, we actually had almost the audacity to come out and recommend to Illinois soybean farmers that not only do you need to use a soil residual herbicide, you need to use it at a full labeled rate. Now, back then, that turned out to be about two steps short of blasphemy. Because why would we want to do that? That only adds cost to our program. It really can't be as bad as you're describing it. That's just the university trying to scare us. And you know what? As long as Roundup works, we ain't going to do anything different. So we've heard really about every possible reason why they didn't at that time want to do anything other than glyphosate. But what a lot of people didn't realize is that those 5 steps that we came up with addressed not only glyphosate resistance, but they also addressed what we knew was going on with ALS resistance at the time, that functionally we had lost that entire line of chemistry against water hemp, because ALS resistance is almost ubiquitous for us now. But we also realized what was happening in the background with PPO resistance. And we knew because of all the years we were trying to add the PPOs in with the ALS materials, that type of resistance was also increasing in the background. But, as I'll show on a distribution map, as we look at glyphosate resistance over time in the state of Illinois, I was completely ineffective in convincing people that this is real and that we really ought to do something a little bit different to try to stay in front of this.
Right. Well, you're not the only one. I mean, in the state of Ohio, we went back to residual herbicides because of mare's tail, because we didn't get a handle on mare's tail. So it was only when we got to that level of problem that we got to that. So, but you probably had another 5 or 6 years before the whole thing blew wide open, and then you had glyphosate resistance, and then you all went right into, so you had 2-way resistance with ALS, and then you went right into 3-way resistance pretty fast, right, with PPO.
Actually, 3 and 4 were very close together. The PPO resistance was something that, again, we knew was really increasing in frequency, because when we did go back to using residual herbicide in soybean, the products of choice were soil applied PPOs. And we're really trying to get the message across to folks that when you think about herbicide resistance, it's not just to foliar applied products, because we're selecting for resistance with our soil applied products also. So things like Authority and Valor, the sulfentrazone, the flumioxazin, we're using a lot more of these products now on a very large percent of our soybean acres than we were 10 or 15 years ago. And we could see that the increase in frequency of PPO resistance was really increasing more rapidly than any other type of resistance that we had in Illinois a few years ago. And part of that, of course, was attributed to the fact we were still trying to patch the hole with glyphosate with some of the foliar applied PPOs, but we were also doing quite a bit of selection and still continue to select with a lot of the soil applies also.
So do you think if you put another herbicide, I'll pick Site 15. We can talk about Site 15 resistance here in a second. But if you put a Site 15 herbicide like Dual or whatever with your Authority or Valor free, does that cut down your selection pressure there?
If you had asked me that 5 years ago, I would have said, yes, it does. But anymore, I'm not sure that it does. And the reason stems because now, let me back up. Historically, our group at Illinois has really made, quote unquote, living for a lot of years trying to look at mechanisms of target site resistance. And, Tranel's lab and Rieker's lab, they've done a phenomenal job in looking at this and better understanding what we have with these types of resistance. But for probably about the last, at least 5 to maybe even 8 years, we've shifted more and more of our focus over to non-target site resistances and specifically looking at metabolic resistance. And target site is fairly simple because you have perhaps only one minor change in the conformation of a target site, and all of a sudden the herbicide is no longer able to bind it. So that's relatively easy to identify and to explain. But when you get into metabolic resistance, which essentially is where the plants are able to rapidly break down the herbicide, and by rapidly, I mean so quickly it doesn't cause any damage to them. The best analogy I can give you is the reason we don't kill corn with atrazine is because corn breaks it down very, very quickly. Waterhemp is now mimicking what corn is doing with products like the Group 15s, with the HPPD chemistry. And by far and away, most of the triazine resistance that we see in Illinois waterhemp populations is not target site based. It's metabolic based. So one of the big challenges with metabolic resistance is, where did it come from? Why do we have it? Are we seeing metabolic resistance now in more populations because we've used triazines for 60, 65 years now? Is it because we've used the Group 15s for 50 to 55 years now? HPPDs for 25 years? We really don't know the origin of what really triggered the uptick in these occurrences of metabolic resistance, which really gives us a challenge, because if we don't know how it evolved, how do we know what the best recommendation is in terms of moving forward with a herbicide control program? We really don't. And I'm not sure anybody really does at this time.
Yeah, I think we're stuck there. And just for the listeners, the target site, so PPO is target site and ALS is target site and glyphosate is target site. And then the metabolic is atrazine, HPPD. Does all the metabolic convert to 2,4-D also, because you have that mutation confers to several sites of action?
That's a good question. And the two populations that we've studied in depth, the answer is yes. And the irony of both of these populations is that we really haven't, we weren't made aware of either of these populations because 2,4-D failed to control them. We were actually made aware of these populations because a foliar application of an HPPD did not control the population. So we started doing broad screenings in the greenhouse. And all of a sudden we looked at these plants after we were sprayed with 2,4-D, and we saw a lot of the symptomology you would normally associate with a sensitive plant, but 14 days later they had essentially recovered. And so now, the other thing that we have to contend with in metabolic resistance is that we really have no predictability. What still works versus what does not work anymore, because why in the world would a population that never had been sprayed with 2,4-D turns out to be up to 30-fold resistant to it? And why would a 2,4-D resistant Waterhemp population from Nebraska that was selected with multiple applications of 2,4-D for years, why would that population be HPPD resistant? But it is.
Right, and so now we have site 15 resistance. Do you want to talk about that? I think I've been telling people, I think that probably comes, at least in part, from our use of site 15 herbicides like Morin and Dual and Pyroxasulfone in post applications. What do you think?
I think that's probably a pretty safe assumption to work under right now. And again, this will actually go back to the first case of HPPD resistance that we discovered. And I think we started our first field trial at that site. I think it was 2010, 2011. And so we were doing various experiments there, and we had one that was soil applied only products for corn. And we noticed that the level of control with metolachlor, S-metolachlor, was much less than we normally expect. And certainly orders, greatly less than what we would see with acetochlor. Now, acetochlor, I think everybody would agree, we tend to rate it stronger on small seeded broadleaves like Waterhemp than we do S-metolachlor. But this difference was way too great just to be random chance. And when it was repeated over the years, it actually came out statistically much less than the level of control that we would get from acetochlor, both assessing control on a visual assessment of control as well as density at the end of the growing season. And so we kept that in the back of our mind, and we really honestly didn't pursue it very much until we found our second population of HPPD resistant Waterhemp. And honestly, on a whim, the graduate student that I had at the time, I asked him when our field season started to go put out about 3 rates of S-metolachlor for me and about 3 rates of acetochlor and let me know when you sprayed it, and I'll go out and look at it about 3 or 4 weeks later. Well, he did that. Lo and behold, we saw the exact same thing, that the level of control with S-metolachlor was so reduced as compared with the level of control that we got from acetochlor. Now, I will confess to everybody listening to this that I am absolutely never in any danger of being nominated for a Nobel Prize, but that just seemed to be way too much of a coincidence. And so we did some more detailed field work on our second location, was able to repeat and confirm our initial observations, moved everything into the greenhouse with some dose response experiments where we had a couple of known sensitive populations. And lo and behold, as I'll just cut to the end, we can actually calculate a resistance ratio now with these 2 populations for all the group 15 products that we looked at. And those would be S-metolachlor, dimethenamide, pyroxasulfone, and acetochlor. Now the ratios vary. It tends to be more resistant to S-metolachlor and less resistant to acetochlor. But that really, I guess, in my opinion, should not signal everybody needs to switch over from S-metolachlor to acetochlor, because you have to remember, even if using acetochlor, the first cohorts that are going to come out of the ground are going to be the resistant.
How many products or site of actions are you looking at that are resistant right now? Just to kind of summarize it.
Right now, we've actually, not in one particular population that we know of, but we have one field population where we can identify resistance to herbicides from 6 different sites of action. There's 7 total that I think have been published now on the resistance website in terms of different mechanisms of action that have evolved resistance. So, and my colleague, Dr. Trownell, did a pretty neat correlation the other day, and he ran the regression on the instances of multiple resistance over time. And what he found is about every 5 years, we add another type of multiple resistance to Waterhemp. So I'm guessing in probably about another 3 years, we'll find either a 7-way or an 8-way resistant population somewhere.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and I think we'll break, right? And talk about management. So, and you covered this a little bit already, but one of the questions I'm getting, and I think it's a really good question, is given what we know about Site 15 resistance, and we assume that once we have Site 15, it crosses over to some extent to everything, all the different chemicals there. As I start to get into water hemp issues, do I pull all the stops out and go ahead and use Site 15 herbicides in my post program, or do I hold that back until I absolutely need it?
That's a good question, Mark, and I really don't have a blanket answer for everything. One thing, we still would encourage people to consider using a Group 15 in a post program if they know that they've got a very dense and heavy population there. But the caveat now is that don't expect that necessarily to last as long as it would on a sensitive population, because how resistance to our soil residual products manifests itself is that the length of residual control gets less and less. So for example, if you had, let's just pull out a number out of the air, let's say you had 4 weeks of good residual control of the sensitive population, it's going to be 4 minus something on a resistant population. We don't know if it's 3 weeks, 2 weeks, it may be a few days less, maybe a few hours less. But again, it's going to be less than what we would normally associate with a sensitive population. So if that fits into your management strategy, go ahead and continue to do it, but be aware that, again, that may not be what you need to carry you throughout the rest of the growing season.
Right, because that's what happens with PPO inhibitors. So when you have PPO resistance, you still have activity from Valor and Authority. They don't last as long.
Exactly. And the reason is, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, because the magnitude of resistance is not that high. And if you think about any soil applied product, we're actually applying these things at orders of magnitude higher rates than what you need to control any germinating seedling at any one point in time. Why do we do that? We want that residual control, of course.
Well, I think we're going to have to break this into 2 episodes, so we'll stop here and make sure you guys join us again in 2 weeks when we release the next one.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.